I'll begin by saying again why I reached out to you in the first place. And one is your book, Lost in a Gallup. But in particular, and we'll get into the book as we go through this conversation. But in particular, what I was interested in, having read other sort of histories of polling, is the the focus on that intersection and that interplay between journalism and polling, which one really grew up inside the other in some respects. Um, and they have a lot of things that they benefit from each other, the sort of interesting synergies, I guess. And then other places where there's a lot of tension. And so I wanted to talk to somebody who knew a lot about the polling side, but really came more from the journalism perspective about all of this. Um, and I'll tell you the other reason why. And that is that as I have been interviewing pollsters throughout the course of starting this show, I will ask them frequently, like, what advice do you have for readers, et cetera, about how to make sense of the things that you're doing? And a pretty consistent complaint from pollsters is about journalism. It is about horse race coverage, and it is about not articulating margins of error clearly, or what have you. And I think you know there's plenty of blame to go around, I suppose. Let's talk to a journalist about this and have that more kind of historical perspective. The other thing I will say is rereading some of the sections of the book in preparation for this interview, I was just struck again by how many problems have been with us since about 1936. And so maybe a good place to start is to talk about why you wrote the book in the first place. What drew you to this topic?
Well, let me just start by saying your observation about pollsters criticizing journalists. I mean, that has deep roots, and it goes back at least
Hmm.
70 years, 75 years. And pollsters are always inclined to criticize journalists, and and saying, "Oh, we need to educate journalists better. We need to educate the public better." I mean, these are refrains really that go back a long, long time
Hmm.
in polling history and election polling history, and it's it is head shakingly familiar over the years, and it's something that it's a weird relationship that pollsters and journalists have. It's an acute love hate
Yes.
relationship in the sense that journalists and pollsters have been together, one sort of encouraging the other for many years, back to
Hmm.
1936 and beyond, even before the advent of quasi-scientific polling methodologies that were introduced in the mid 1930s. But even before then, polling and journalism were pretty close. I mean, the Literary
Yes.
Digest was a well-known magazine that, for varying reasons, started its massive mail-in polling back in the 1920s. And in part, it was due to help support its
Hmm.
circulation. It was a circulation that was in decline, and this was one way to sort of help boost circulation. So they would send out millions of sample ballots, postcard ballots to people across the country, asking them in the run up to presidential elections and some other elections as well to send these back
Hmm.
in with the preference of the candidate checked off, as well as giving the Literary Digest the address or the city where the postcard was
Right.
being returned from. In addition to that, there was on that postcard a box that could be checked if you wanted to subscribe to the Literary Digest. So it had this dual purpose. And for the longest time, for like 3 or 4 presidential election cycles, the Literary Digest poll, this massive mail-in poll, got
Hmm.
it right, signaled the correct winner in the
Hmm.
presidential election. And in 1932, it was really almost spot on in terms of predicting Franklin Roosevelt's overwhelming victory against Herbert Hoover, the then Republican
Mm.
president, the incumbent. And so Literary Digest had this following. Everybody thought it was the oracle, the
Right.
oracle of polling. And it ran into major difficulties in 1936. Again, and we're kind of then at the depths of the Great Recession. Maybe the country's slowly
Hmm.
easing out of the Great Recession, but by then Franklin Roosevelt had imposed or had brought to bear some New Deal policies that included a lot more government intrusion in daily life in the United States, there was considerable opposition to that within the Democratic Party. So it was unclear in 1936 just whether the Literary Digest was going to be able to get it right again. And the Digest thought it would. I mean, thought, every poll that we've taken has been accurate, and we've told people what's going to happen before it happens. And it was that kind of smugness that it was associated with the Literary Digest polling in 1936. And this massive mail-in poll, 10 million people were sent postcards, and like 2.4 million, 2.3, 2.4 million returned completed postcards. And this is a massive, massive survey, a massive response rate. And the final tally that the Literary Digest released at the end of October 1936 showed that Franklin Roosevelt would lose to the Republican candidate, the Republican nominee, Alf Landon, overwhelmingly. Overwhelmingly. It was not going to be even close. The then upstart pollsters who were using quasi-scientific methodology included George Gallup, Elmo Roper, and Archibald Crossley. These three guys were coming out with a different reading, signaling that Franklin Roosevelt would indeed win that election. So it was a real standoff between the venerable Literary Digest, which had a strong track record of polling accuracy, and these upstart pollsters using sort of sampling methodology in some respects. And largely unknown, certainly not as well known as a Literary Digest. So it was a real standoff between these two approaches, these two techniques, these two kinds of polling. And the Literary Digest lost badly in 1936. It was an overwhelming landslide for Franklin Roosevelt, who won every state, all 48 states except for Maine and Vermont. And it was a crushing loss for the Literary Digest. And it was a real measure of support for the new upstart pollsters, Gallup, Roper, and Crossley, all of whom, by the way, were relying on newspapers or magazines for their support. By then, Gallup had recruited a number of newspapers, including the Washington Post and Boston Globe, to subscribe to his service, to his polling service. And Elmo Roper's polling was published in the Fortune magazine, and Archibald Crossley's polls were done for the New York Journal of William Randolph Hearst, a sensational, big-time newspaper in metropolitan New York. So it's a long-winded way of saying, I guess, that this relationship between pollsters and journalism goes deep. It's been tight, and it's also it's been marked by periods of mistrust and distrust.
These three men are so interesting because they wind up, for me at least, sort of serving almost as archetypes of the of polling camps that still exist, where Gallup comes out. Well, he has a psychology degree, but if I'm correct about that, but winds up working for Young and Rubicam. And as someone who spent 20 years in advertising, I'm sorry, but also that like that kind of market research side of things, using survey research to sell products and services, was already in kind of full swing. Gray Advertising was sort of famous for being the data-driven advertising agency in the old days. They even would publish kind of syndicated research reports. But so he comes out of Young and Rubicam. He seems to be kind of satisfied no matter what the results, or at least is willing to say he's satisfied no matter what the results. And you have a great quote in there from him, or summary of something he said that was something along the lines of, we're doing forecasts to kind of check our work on the polling side. Like, this is all just a fun thought experiment for us. Like, we'll just keep tweaking things. And he had strong opinions about methodology and so on. Roper is a jewelry retailer or something to begin with, and gets into market research and polling and becomes more disillusioned about forecasting in general and thinks, no, really what survey research is for is understanding people and analysis and that sort of thing. And then we have poor Crossley, who spends the early part of his career being able to publish the actual results of his research under headlines that are misleading because it's the Hearst papers. And there was a recent one of these where there was like I can't remember who the polling partners were, but a Media Plus polling firm. And if you read the polling firm's press release, it's all very muted and calm. If you read the news headline that accompanies it, it's a bit more exuberant about the results. And I just reading through the book, I was like, yep, we just gotta keep doing these things. But what and then obviously we have to talk about Harris, who comes out of Roper's firm. But those kind of early innovators of this more scientific approach to polling, apart from the straw poll that had been popular in a lot of magazines, especially Literary Digest, how do you see their legacy now? What do you see as kind of still around from their days, and what do you think we've moved on from?
It's interesting to recognize how popular they remain, especially George Gallup. I mean, he's a venerated figure in the polling industry, in the polling field, and he's one of these guys whose reputation is better than it deserves to be,
Mhm.
frankly. He was a prickly guy. He was really somebody who was not very patient with critics. He would assail and assault them,
Mhm.
not physically, but in writing and in speeches. He had no truck with people who criticized his polling methods and polling results. And one of his targets was a sociologist at Columbia University named Lindsay Rogers, who wrote the book, incredibly well-timed book called The
Mhm.
Pollsters. It came out in 1949, early 1949, which was right after the most famous and the most devastating polling failure in U.S. presidential history, the most surprising for sure. And that was the Dewey defeats Truman election of
Mhm.
1948, in which Gallup and Roper and Crossley all believed that Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican governor of New York, was easily going to win election that year and unseat Harry Truman, the Democratic president who became president on Franklin Roosevelt's death in
Mhm.
1945. And these guys stopped polling early. I mean, I think Gallup stopped about 2 weeks early, Crossley 3 weeks early, and Roper announced in September, shortly after Labor Day in September 1948, that he was going to release no further polling results because it was a done deal that Dewey was going to win by a heavy margin,
Mhm.
Roper said. Now, it turns out that Roper did another poll quietly at the end of October, but it didn't show any dramatic movement towards Truman, so he didn't
Right.
publish the poll. And but it wouldn't have mattered anyway because he figured that Dewey was going to win by about 15 points. Gallup and Crossley were a little more conservative, figuring about a 5 point
Mm.
win for Dewey. And it turned out to be Truman by four and a
Right.
half points. So for Gallup and Crossley, it was like a 9.5 point miss. And for Roper, it was
Mhm.
even bigger, like on the order of 18, 19 points, almost akin to what had happened to the Literary Digest in 1936. So these guys got their comeuppance pretty quickly in the evolution or history of
Mhm.
election polling, modern election polling. And one of the reasons for their overconfidence was that they had this belief that people didn't change their minds
Right.
after
Yeah.
Labor Day. That everything was kind of set in stone by then, and that was the case in 1936, 1940, and 1944, all of which were Franklin Roosevelt elections, pretty
Mhm.
overwhelmingly. And there did not seem to be, to these three guys, Gallup, Roper, and Crossley, that there was much movement among voters in the months before the campaign, and they really doubted, especially Roper, didn't think there was much use for political campaigns. It was all noise and all clamor, but really very little substantial movement. So he was willing to say, "That's it. I'm going to move on to other things." And this 1948 election is decided by
Mhm.
Labor Day, and
Yeah.
they were all wrong. They were all wrong. But it did appear back in the early days that election campaigns didn't much matter. But that was more of a phenomenon, as it turned out, associated with Franklin Roosevelt than with presidential elections
So
in
that
general.
that is something that stood out to me, because obviously the kind of new conventional wisdom, more or less, is that, um, some of the folks at 538 now will say this explicitly, that there's kind of no point in looking at polls until after Labor Day, as opposed to thinking it's all sewn up by then. And the kind of idea of, when do general election voters really start paying attention to the election and thinking about what they're going to do when they eventually do cast a ballot, that kind of keeps getting pushed later and later and later. Um, and yeah.
I think it depends on the
Hmm.
election, though. Sometimes the candidates really do make a difference in terms of how well known they are to the voters, and how quickly things
Mhm.
are sewn up. And each election, like each polling failure, is different. These are not springing from the same template time and time again. So I think it really does matter who's running, and
Yeah.
just the circumstances of the election. But there's pretty good evidence. I wouldn't say completely persuasive, but it's pretty good that there are October surprises that
Mhm.
can make a difference. I mean, Hillary Clinton believes that she lost the election in 2016 because James Comey announced 11 days before the election in 2016 that the FBI was reopening its investigation into aspects of her personal
Mhm.
email server. And she believes that that was enough to deter undecided voters, or to have undecided voters swing to Trump in the latter
Mhm.
days of the campaign. And there's some data compiled by the American Association for Public Opinion
Mhm.
Research, APOR, which commissioned a study after the 2016 and 2020 elections. And the 2016 report, the report about the 2016 election, has some data in it that does suggest that late deciding voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and
Mhm.
Florida, those four swing states, made up their minds late in the campaign, the last 2 weeks. And when they did, they went for Trump rather than for
Mhm.
Hillary
Mhm.
Clinton. And
Yeah.
that was enough, apparently enough for Trump to win those four states, especially the three Great Lakes states, and win the presidency. Had Hillary Clinton won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, she
Right.
would have won the presidency in
Right.
2016. And that was her blue
The
wall, supposed blue
supposed blue
wall.
wall. I mean, it is also interesting to observe how, and you do this in the book. It's really like every election or every other election, there's a pretty big polling miss, and I think one of the things that lay readers may not understand about polling is it's not a set it and forget it approach, right? Like it's not like they come up with one way of doing it and then they do it the same way every election cycle. Even to some degree, and I know that this is a refrain from people like Nate Silver and others, we're not talking about a large sample of presidential races. There are not that many elections, and each one of them is different in some way. And so being able to compare apples to apples, they argue, is tricky. It's even funny to think about Literary Digest having been so successful at predicting electoral outcomes. They had done so 4 times, right? And so, like, 4 times is a lot in the universe of 16 years of being right, but they're only making that prediction every 4 years. Here, it's very interesting to see in your book this they're overestimating a landslide. They're expecting they're thinking there's going to be a landslide and there isn't. It's very close. They think it's going to go one way, it goes the other way. They're expecting it to be very close, it's not. Like all of these kinds of things. And there seem to be a variety of sort of causes of that. And some of it's methodological changes in how they sample or how they contact people or who they sample, all of those things. Some of it seems to just be um, one of my favorite Mark Twain lines is about the cat on the hot stove lid, who, having done so, will not sit on a cold one either. Like, you know, and there does seem to be this over learning the lessons each time and kind of reacting to the way we got it wrong last time. Let's not get it wrong that way this time. And maybe that's okay for one election. And then the next election, it turns out you've got new problems.
True enough. I mean, I think that's absolutely the case. And your rundown a moment ago about how they've gotten it wrong, missing landslides or thinking it's a close election when a
Hmm.
landslide happens, which was the case in
Yeah.
1980 when Reagan defeated Carter. Um, but they've also messed up because of state level
Mhm.
polling, which is the story really of
Right.
2016, because so many poll based forecasts, including Nate Silver's and others, were relying on state polls that went off the rails in
Mm.
some respects, and helped to distort the outcome of that pre-election period. The Huffington Post polling based forecast, presidential forecast in 2016, gave Hillary Clinton a 98.2% chance of winning election. And that was even topped by the Princeton election consortium, which was headed by a neuroscientist by the name of Samuel Wang. And Wang gave Hillary Clinton a 99% chance of winning, and said that if Donald Trump wins 240 electoral votes, not even enough to win the election, but 240 electoral votes, he would go on television and eat a bug.
Yes, such a good story.
Of course, Trump won a little more than 300 electoral
Mhm.
votes in 2016. So Samuel Wang, on the Saturday after the election, went on a CNN program, bringing along a can of gourmet crickets intended for pets. And after a moment or two of preliminaries, he scooped out a dollop of gourmet cricket and popped it in his mouth and redeemed his pledge to eat a bug if Trump won more than 240 electoral votes. So pollster and poll related cockiness is another theme that is traceable through these presidential elections back to 1936 and even before. Pollsters really start believing their own
Mhm.
headlines and their own clippings and think that they
Right.
have it nailed. And we saw that in some respects with the 2016 election. We saw it a number of times with George
Mhm.
Gallup, and this guy would take out double page ads in editor and publisher to proclaim his
Yes.
polling accuracy, and that they predicted it. This is back in the 1940s. Predicted it with almost spot on accuracy when it really wasn't quite that good, but still it was emblematic of this certain swagger, cockiness that even to this day can be
Mhm.
detected in the polling
I mean, it's
world.
even interesting to think about the 98 point the point two of the 98%, right? Is this certainty to the first decimal place seems a little bit ill suited to the instrument, let's say. Like this is we're not actually able to get that level of precision in any kind of authentic sense. This is something that I think about a lot as a market researcher, where my clients are generally speaking not asking me to make predictions. They are using research to understand something or to help them model their potential choices and then make the best decision for their business that they can. And we don't get in trouble later if the bet doesn't pay out for them as the business, because that's not what we've been asked to do. And it's so strange to me that these two things they are fundamentally the same set of tools. They're built on the same social science. I read many of the same papers that pollsters read about response bias and non-response bias and those kinds of things, but I'm putting it to a very different use. How did we get to this place where survey research in Roper's construction meant to help us understand things becomes a method of prophecy? Why are we making predictions with polls?
Those roots go way back to those early days of Gallup, Roper, and Crossley, and perhaps and even
Mhm.
before with the Literary Digest. I mean, it was touting the Digest was touting the accuracy of its polls, and it would reprint compliments published in other publications, other newspapers and magazines about the uncanny accuracy of its polls. The Digest called these press bouquets, and from time to time it would publish a collection of press bouquets from other publications about the accuracy and the uncanny effectiveness of its polling. So that has
Mhm.
deep roots. This sort of predictive nature of polling goes way back, and the reason it's done, frankly, is to try to get a sense of what the election is going to look like. It responds to a human urge to know
Right.
what's going to happen. And pollsters these days tend to shy away from saying, "Well, this is not really a prediction; it's an
Mhm.
estimate." Snapshot
Right.
in time, which is one of those sayings that just drives me up the wall. But because I think
Yeah.
it's a dodge in many respects. But anyway, um, it goes way back. And you mentioned earlier how Gallup and Roper and Crossley, all three of them came from
Mhm.
market research. And Roper in particular, he was a failed jeweler
Mm.
in Iowa, and but during his time as a jeweler in Iowa, he did begin to understand the importance of consumer preferences and consumer
Mhm.
tastes and how that could be measured, and so he brought that with him to New York when he became a market researcher in New York, and so polling was really sort of
Mhm.
in a way, a spin-off of market research. At
Yeah.
least the two fields or subfields are very closely attached. Gallup, of course, was with Young and Rubicam, but before that, he was a journalism
Right.
teacher at Drake and at
Mhm.
Northwestern University. So he's got his foot in journal. In fact, I think he referred to some of his early polling as a akin to a wire
Hmm.
service of
Right.
public opinion. So there's this linkage between journalism, but the even more striking linkage, I think, is in
Mhm.
market research, especially with the likes of Roper and Crossley, who was doing research. Crossley was doing research about
Right.
radio listeners and radio listenership. There was a Crossley service that was really well known back in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, if you listen to the famous broadcast or infamous broadcast of the War
Hmm.
of the Worlds by Orson Welles, this adaptation of a Martian invasion, the War of the Worlds was the title of the book, by H.G. Wells, but Orson Welles's interpretation or adaptation to radio refers in the early going to the Crossley service as to how many people
Yes.
were listening on a particular night. So that was how his fame, Archibald Crossley's fame,
Yeah.
really took
I
hold.
mean, that's actually a
And
very
the
famous early case study in the development of what becomes ratings of trying to figure out how many people listened to that
yes,
and
exactly,
also how many people
yeah,
believed it.
precisely.
Which is
Well, not many people believed it, and not many people listened to it. It's a great myth in American journalism. I know we're getting off target a little bit topic here, but it's a myth that I have examined in another book at another
oops,
time.
it's okay.
Sorry, the War
Yes.
of the Worlds
Of
gets me all
course.
worked up. but it's America did not
Right.
panic that night. In fact, it was a radio show that was innovative and novel, but didn't have
Hmm.
a great audience, and so there's lots of
And you
reasons
tell that
why
story in Getting It
it's
Wrong, is that right? Yeah.
that's right in the book Getting It Wrong, and it's a favorite. It always comes back around
Yes.
Halloween time, and how Americans panicked back in
Yes.
1938, and how unsophisticated those radio listeners were compared to how media savvy we are today. There's that
Hmm.
underlying thread to this War of the Worlds myth, which is timeless. It's
Yeah.
tireless. It's never going to
Yes.
be debunked.
it,
It's never
it's
going to
too
be
good of a
debunked. But
story.
anyway, Crossley Service. Yeah, it is too good of a story not to be true. But Crossley
Yeah.
Service is mentioned in there, and you're right. The ratings. It's an early attempt to get a sense of ratings
Right.
for advertisers and for people who are sponsoring these programs.
So this, there's multiple directions I want to take this, but I think maybe the first place to start is about so once we stop having just the magazine itself doing straw polls via reply cards, um, and move towards this more sort of scientific polling partnerships between news organizations and polling services, or having their own pollsters. That's that sort of evolution of things. It seems like this is the beginning of what, in the last 10 or 12 years, has been reframed as data journalism, but has gone through a few waves of just, injecting more sort of social science rigor into journalism, and then the precision journalism movement. And like we keep kind of having these, and I will also cop to this. I worked in advertising, but I got my advertising degree in the journalism school at the University of Oregon. So you had to take journalism classes, um, which was great. That was, it could have gone either way. But one of the things that is this story of the evolution of journalism is it going from kind of a yeoman trade to becoming professionalized, and then that sort of evolution of therefore that we must have journalistic standards and so on and so forth. Um, What's going on there with this sort of, and the other thing I'll add into this is I was at a panel discussion at the Newmark School at CUNY a week and a half ago, and a refrain amongst the panelists was, should we even be the ones interviewing people about subject X or Y? Should it not be a historian or an anthropologist or a sociologist? And again, it made me think about some of these trends in your book as well, of wanting to have journalism take on more of the science part of social science. And what do you think sort of accounts for that recurrent desire to be more scientific or be more rigorous or be more professionalized um, in the journalism profession over the years?
You mentioned precision journalism, which was
Mhm.
Philip Meyer's best known book. He was a journalist, an educator, who also was president for a year, for a term, of the American Association for Public
Mhm.
Opinion Research, APOR. So Phil Myers, one of the unusual characters in American journalism and American polling, who has a foot in either camp and is
Mhm.
well respected by both journalists and pollsters. His book on precision polling goes back to
Right.
1973. So it's been an attempt to bring the more rigorous approach of social science to American journalism, and that was, it was more than a fad.
Mhm.
I mean, journalism is susceptible. American journalism is susceptible to fads and faddish ways, but this one is one that has endured and has gone through different
Mhm.
permutations. I don't know to what extent Nate Silver embraces precision journalism as part of his data journalism, but it's
Mhm.
very clear that that's what he's doing.
Right.
Data journalism, bringing some modeling and other factors. And he doesn't do polling, but he uses polls to make his poll-based forecasts, and has done so since 2008. But journalism and polling, as I've mentioned a couple of times, goes way back. And perhaps the strongest ties were those that were developed again in the mid 70s, around the time of Phil Myers' book, when the New York Times and CBS News hooked up and
Mhm.
teamed up to do to do polling. And this was an association that was a long
Mhm.
pedigree. They lasted this association lasted for quite a while, and it anticipated a lot of other media polling done by media organizations, or media organizations would commission polling organizations to do the work for them, or just whatever permutation it took. But there were a lot of these uh, joint ventures, if you will, in journalism to do polling sprung up beginning, as I say, in the 1970s. And one of the reasons to do so was to get a better sense of just what public opinion was like. It's another way of
Mm.
gathering the news. Now that was controversial. Not everybody was saying that this is a great thing to do. This is journalism and journalists injecting themselves in the story. This is something that
Hmm.
journalists shouldn't do, haven't done, ought not to do. And there was a considerable amount of controversy attached to it
Hmm.
at the time, in the 70s and early 80s, about whether this is the right thing for journalists to be doing. I think that argument has largely died out, and in part because of the work of Phil Meyer and his predecessors, but also some of the data journalism that Nate Silver sponsored, or
Mhm.
trailblazed, if you will, beginning in 2008. So there's really not much of a discussion these days as to whether this is the proper thing for journalists to be doing, to be going out and
Mhm.
surveying people. And in fact, if you look at the history of polling, you find journalists doing
Right.
just that in crude ways, all the way back to like
Sure.
1828, in the time of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And they were doing straw polls that were reported in newspapers in North Carolina and Pennsylvania that far back. So that's almost
Mhm.
200 years. But it's an interesting dynamic, and it's an interesting um, way in which journalists and pollsters are pretty close. But at the same time, there is this underlying
Yes.
suspicion, I think, on both sides of the aisle. There were people who uh, Eric Sevareid, a former CBS News commentator, he confessed to having a secret delight when polls went bad, because it was a way in which it would demonstrate how polling cannot really do its job of getting into the psyche and anticipating what Americans are really believing and what they really want to do. And some of that rhetoric, was poll bashing rhetoric, was not uncommon in the 60s and 70s and 80s and even
Mhm.
in the 90s. There were a well-known columnist in Chicago, Mike
Mhm.
Royko, who actually in his columns occasionally encouraged readers
Yeah.
to lie to pollsters were they to be contacted by pollsters, in a way to throw off the
Mhm.
exit polls. I guess that was his real target, because on election night, the exit polls would sort of give you a real good sense of who was
Right.
going to win and not. And he said that drained all the excitement out of election night. Um, it was kind of a naive approach, unless he meant it tongue in cheek, which was not to be ruled out. But I think it was also emblematic of the suspicion that journalists have about pollsters and the polling field. So this acute love hate relationship that I referred to earlier, has played out over the years in lots of different ways. And poll bashing has seemed to subsided pretty dramatically among American journalists, because American journalists, or American journalism, is also
Mhm.
polling, is into the polling industry. So there's this liaison that gets stronger with every
That's
election
a really
cycle, it
interesting
seems.
point, because I think, there was much made, obviously, after 2016 about the polls being wrong, and there was a relatively seemingly clear explanation for at least part of that, and that was attributed to the undersampling of non-college educated voters, of having an overrepresentation of college educated voters. So 2020, we make sure we've got enough enough non-college voters in the sample, and the APOR report that came out after 2020 kind of threw up its hands and went, I suppose it's non-response bias, which is a pollster way of saying we didn't have the right people in the poll, right? That they're,
Or we had more of one kind of person, but not
yeah.
enough of another. The representation by, say,
Hmm.
Democrats and Republicans was not kind of equivalent or adequate to make the estimates they did, and I think that did throw
Yeah.
off a lot of the polls. But again, you're right; it's a hypothesis; it's not proven, and it's really difficult to go back and figure out exactly where the
Yeah.
polls went wrong. And after 2016, you're right; the working hypothesis was that it was non-college educated white males who were, inclined to vote for Trump but not inclined to take a poll, and that's not a unanimous position
Hmm.
among pollsters. Some pollsters said, I was weighting my data for, or
Hmm.
statistically adjusting my data for just that level of education, and it
Hmm.
still was screwed up. So um, it's difficult. I mean, polling is a very difficult enterprise. It's fragile. It's susceptible to error of all kinds, not just
Hmm.
sampling error, but other kinds of error, non-response bias
Right.
being among them. Getting to the right people, or the right people in terms of
Hmm.
a mix of people with affiliations, Republican, Democrat,
Right.
neither, and so forth. So it's a difficult thing to do, but still, you have to commend pollsters for being out there trying to experiment with different methods and different ways and different
Hmm.
techniques of getting to voters, and and tweaking or overhauling, modifying their methodologies, their polling techniques. Whether they're going to be accurate
Yeah.
remains to be seen. I think that one of the great known unknowns of this election, the 2024 election, is whether the polls again are going to underestimate
Yeah.
Donald Trump's support, as they did in 2016 and pretty clearly in 2020. And that is a known unknown. We're not going to know the answer really
Hmm.
until after
And it
the
also
election.
struck me as I was, thinking about the stories of the swings back and forth, and the move to caution, and then the nope, we feel pretty confident about this, and oh, we're wrong again, move to caution, kind of moments where I found myself wondering, I wonder if this year is the year where everyone is overcompensating for the underrepresentation of Trump voters, and that's part of why everything looks so close all the time, and that maybe it's not as close as it looks, and we won't know until 6 weeks from now. Um,
That really does evoke the 1980
mhm.
dynamic in a way, between Jimmy Carter, the incumbent president, and Ronald Reagan, the Republican challenger, and it looked like, for the most part, most pollsters were signaling it was a very close race up until the last days of the election, when a lot of people seem to have swung toward Ronald Reagan, giving him essentially a
Right.
landslide victory over Jimmy Carter. It was a near landslide, maybe it was 9.5 points. 10 points
Yeah.
essentially is the marker for a landslide. So yeah, maybe, who knows, if it's tied up until the end and then there's a swing one way or the other at the very end, it might be difficult for
Yeah.
pollsters to capture. It
Yeah.
was in 1980. And one of the lessons of election polling is to, and then pollsters don't always keep this in mind or haven't always completely learned it, is poll as late as you possibly can.
Mhm.
Poll until the last weekend or last days of the campaign, because then there could be some shifts. And if you're not polling late in the campaign, you might miss those. And there's been evidence.
Mhm.
1948 is one example, but there have been others of late shifts in the campaign that pollsters didn't pick up, and thereafter
The
running
80
errors.
campaign is also interesting because of the role of exit polling, and that also was sort of a 1970s innovation, was what we're going to go sort of randomly sample precincts and stand outside and ask, pull random people out of the line and ask them what they did.
Usually like
Yeah.
every 10 or 12, something like that. There was some
Yeah.
sequence to it, but anyway.
That's a good note of how that I think a lot of times people hear randomly selected and they think, oh, it's just entirely up to some sort of discretion. And actually,
Yeah,
there's like an
right,
nth
right,
process to these things where we pick some number and go through the list.
precisely.
But um, uh, the interesting thing about that one was NBC News calling it before the polls had closed. And then this begets a story about and that like we still have exit polling where they hold off on calling it before a particular time so that most people have a chance to vote on election night. But maybe talk about what happened there, because it did go the opposite way of what the polling had indicated up to that point, which is showing that pretty decisive result for Reagan.
That's right. And by 6, 7 o'clock at night Eastern time, it was pretty clear, according to NBC, that Reagan was going to win. And based on exit polls, as you described, they're done of people who were exiting the polling place, the ballot, after having cast their ballot. And NBC took the risk of saying, well, our data indicate that Ronald Reagan is going to be elected president. And polls on the West Coast were still open, and other parts of the country too. I think even New York
Mm-hmm.
was still open. And there was a furor about this early announcement by NBC News deprived a lot of voters or discouraged voters from actually casting their ballots, and that had the effect in some places, such as Oregon, of of turning out of office a long-serving congressman or senator. I mean, there was supposedly a lot of effects from NBC's early announcement, but a lot of efforts made in the subsequent years to try to find people who actually did leave the
Mm.
lines to vote and said, I'm not going to do it because the election's over. There doesn't seem to be much evidence to
Hmm.
support this notion. And a scholar at Georgetown did some really impressive work on this a few years ago, longer than that perhaps now, of just looking at the effects of early calls on voting behavior in various ways in various states, including counties that were straddling the
Mm.
time zone, either
Right.
central and mountain or mountain and Pacific, and just to see. And there was a lot of good work that went into this study, and he came away thinking, no, this doesn't matter, because people's voting behaviors are really set by things way more profound and way more significant than a election night call by a network news
Right.
channel, and he's right. Voting behavior is in some respects inherited, some respects learned. I mean, you make up your minds about candidates, and it's not really susceptible to change by what network news says on
Right.
election night. And but for the longest time, exit polling was believed to be really the holy grail here. This is the most accurate, the most reliable of opinion sampling that you can do. Talk to voters as they leave the polling place, and you'll get a good sense of what the election outcome was. So that looked really good. It worked pretty well
Right.
until it didn't. Until it didn't. And 20 years ago in the 2004 election, when exit polls were indicating that John Kerry was going to be elected the next president, exit polls that year went
Mm.
off the rails, and it was another way in which polls can fail. And heretofore, up until then, exit polls had been pretty much on target. They were so respected and so relied upon and so believed that Kerry's one of his top aides referred to him that evening as, said something to the effect of
Mm.
Mr. President, or may I be the first to call you Mr. President? And Kerry said supposedly, no, 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 not now, not yet. And but that was like at 7 o'clock at night in the East, and but by midnight it was pretty clear that George W. Bush had been reelected, and and that the exit polls were
Hmm.
way off or wrong, and so they were good until they weren't.
Yeah.
The exit
I mean,
polls.
that also is that fair to say that that sort of coincides with the sort of consortium AP VoteCast approach of like we're going to try to do something to formalize this, have a central exit polling group. I know that Edison also does exit polling, and people have decided you can't trust Edison exit polls either. But like what each time there is a polling failure, and I put it in quotes because of the work I do, which is just sort of like you're always kind of in a reasonable margin of error, not always, but often within a reasonable margin of error. And sometimes the people characterizing a poll get out over their skis. But in my world, these results would be acceptable. But again, no one's asking me to make a prediction about which flavor of soft drink someone's going to buy the most of. And also, like I've said this before in conversations with other people in polling, but the key difference for me is any given product my clients sell, there isn't one day every 4 years that people can buy it, right? So there's no sense in making those kinds of predictions. But exit polling is interesting because it feels like it should be really well positioned to get a real sense of what people have done and why. And so in response to that 2004 fail, talk a bit about what's happened since.
I think in 2004, the precincts that were chosen for people to go to were a bit off, and then also the interviewers had a fair amount of discretion, which was a problem back in the 1940s and 1948 election. There was just too much interviewer discretion to get a real good, accurate sample, and I think that was at work in the 2004 exit polls as well. That they were not, really rigorously following that every nth voter as the voter left the polling place, and so it got to be screwed up in a number of ways in a number of precincts, and it was just a mess in 2004. But you're right, it's still around. Exit polling is still around, and the networks have committed not to release the data until I think that the poll takers themselves won't disclose the data to their clients until sometime in the afternoon on election day. Still, there's problems with exit polling, and VoteCast, AP VoteCast survey, which was touted as an elaboration on exit polling, that offered an indication about how voters were thinking before and after the election. This is in 2020. It really was misleading, and it forecast or estimated that Joe Biden led by 10 points on election eve, and he won by 4.5 points. So that's a substantial miss. And they also miscalled the AP Vocast. Also miscalled some of the states too. That they thought Biden was going to win, like Florida and Iowa, North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas.
Yeah,
he lost them all in 2020. So this was not a real great rollout of what they were doing. I think overall they overestimated the Democrats' vote share by a couple percentage points. So overall, and underestimated the Republicans by 3 points. So you look at that and you get close to about a 5-point miss overall. And as I say, Biden won by 4.5 points. But there, of course, there were more traditional pollsters who also missed high. And CNN had in its last poll, released it in late October, not in early November, but late October, had Biden up by 12 points. Quinnipiac University had Biden up by 11. NBC News and the Wall Street Journal joint poll had Biden up by 10. And there were others with double-digit leads for Biden in 2020. And they all missed. It was a 4.5-point win. I mean, clear enough, but not a landslide, as a double-digit lead would suggest. Plus, in 2020, if there had been a well-placed, strategically placed shift of 43,000 votes from Biden to Trump spread across key precincts in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, 43,000 votes in those three states would have left those three states in Trump's camp instead of Biden's camp, resulting in a 269 electoral college tie. Now you can imagine in the year of COVID, the COVID pandemic of 2020, on top of that, the urban unrests in the summer of 2020, what an electoral college tie between Trump and Biden would have produced in the country. I mean, maybe a shock too many or something. I don't know, but it was that close. It was a very close election, and as was the 2020 election or 2016 election, the shift of 77 or 79,000 votes from Trump to Clinton would have won her the presidency. So we're in a period of very tight races and very tight presidential campaigns. So the talk of landslides, which is still here, is A, premature, and B, to be treated with high degree of
Yeah.
suspicion. Just given what we're in nowadays in terms of a really, really
Yes.
divided electorate. And the last time we had a landslide in a presidential election was 1984
Right.
when Reagan almost ran the table and won 49 states against Walter
Yes. I mean, I
Mondale.
think that's my sense of the landslide talk is we're grading it on a curve now, where if it's more than about 4 points, it's a landslide. Uh,
Well, I think the real rule of thumb really is and ought to be 10
mhm.
points or more. I mean, that corresponds to like a 420 or 440 electoral vote uh, win, and that really
Yeah.
signals a landslide. But we're nowhere near that, unless this year's going to turn out to be 1980 when everybody shifts at the last minute to one candidate
Yeah.
or the other. But
It also seems like some shakeups have, these shakeups happen every 20 years or so in how the relationships between newsrooms and pollsters shift. And it feels like one of the things that's interesting to think about is those historical relationships that lasted decades between New York Times, CBS, NBC, Wall Street Journal, and those relationships are no more. Um, Instead, and actually, those are two interesting cases because the Wall Street Journal decided to work with outside pollsters and have an R pollster and a D pollster work on the polls together, and then do some stuff with NORC also, in all fairness, for sort of bigger social trends and social issues research, and then report on the results. Whereas the New York Times partnered with Santa College and the L2 voter file to do probabilistic, registered voter verified polling and try to basically become what is now frequently referred to as the gold standard media pollster. Um, what do you make of those two decisions? One to kind of no longer have the polling happen in house, the other to like very much be the pollster.
I think that it depends in some respects on just how much it costs. And polling, that's another element of polling. Not only is it fragile, difficult to do, and prone to error, but it is also very difficult. I mean, it's also
Hmm.
very expensive. And so I think that it might be, I don't know for sure, but I think it's easier to um, share some of the costs of polling if you do have a polling partner, a polling
Hmm.
relationship. And if you do have one, CNN uses a suburban Philadelphia company called
Right.
SSRS to do its polling, and has used outside
Hmm.
vendors, if you will, outside research organizations for over a number of years, over a number
Yeah.
of cycles. So it's an industry, it's a field that is always in some
Hmm.
flux, and those relationships don't always last, don't
Hmm.
always endure, um, and sometimes it's unclear as to why these relationships
Hmm.
dissolve, but they do dissolve, and they um, do not
Yeah.
last forever. And then some polling organizations have dropped out of election polling. The Gallup organization being the most prestigious or
Hmm.
best known of them, it quit election polling after the
Right.
2012 election, which it got wrong. Its final poll had Mitt Romney, the Republican, up by 1 point over Barack Obama. And throughout the campaign, the Gallup polls, the tracking polls that Gallup was organizing and running, had Romney up by a fairly healthy, very clear margin against the incumbent Barack Obama. And it turned out to be wrong. And I think that after that, Gallup did a deep dive as to why it got it wrong in 2012, explained this at a news conference in Washington a year or two later, and then announced that it was not going to do these what they call horse race polls anymore. And also, the Pew Research Organization dropped out for a
Hmm.
while anyway. I don't know if Pew is back full time doing election polling or not. I've seen a couple of election polls that they've done this year, but for a time anyway, they were no
Hmm.
longer doing election polling. And Gallup was more interested, it said, in election polling, or what the American voter, the American public was interested in terms of the major issues of the day. So it was sort of shifted away from election polling pretty dramatically to issues
Mhm.
oriented polling. But Gallup did not have a great track record. I mean, 2012 was the end of the line in terms of its election polling, but it had some
Right.
miscalls before that too, and of course most dramatically 1948, but in more recent years
Yeah.
after that. So, um, and I think these relationships, these polling media relationships, do rely on accuracy in some respects. I think that's one reason that they
Mhm.
dissolve. And if they have problems with getting it right or getting it close to right, then it's a relationship that's more
Right.
untenable in the longer term.
There's another element of the relationship that I find fascinating, and I think the interview that sort of encapsulates it was one that I think maybe Ben Smith at Semaphore did with Joe Kahn at the New York Times about polling and about election coverage and issue coverage, and that there were a couple of things in that interview that Joe Kahn gets criticized for. One was essentially saying that, in a sense, the polls are what are guiding editorial decisions about what issues to cover. So if the economy and immigration are in the top two issues on a battery in a poll, for the voters that are sampled, then that's what we're going to cover: the economy and immigration. And of course, you had people who would then say, well, okay, sure. If you take the rolled up number, if you look at women, abortion makes it into the top three issues, and you're not covering that as much, or what. I mean, people can quibble over the prioritization of the coverage. I think what struck me as interesting about that statement was having the polls play a role in editorial judgment about what's worth covering in an election year. And I'm like, again, this dynamic of the love hate is so fascinating, because it's like, we want it, we hate it, we need it, we hate it, we rely on it, we don't want to rely on it. We're spending all this money on polls, the polls are wrong. Like, it feels a little schizophrenic sometimes. But what, as a journalist, what do you make of that as a practice? I mean, I think the other through line in a lot of your book is the refrain about the inherent unpredictability of the American people, and about the need for that sort of shoe leather work to actually go and meet people where they were. And that might be haphazard and lack rigor too, but this balance between good sort of horse sense among journalists versus what are the polls telling us? And I'm curious, as a journalist, what you make of reliance on poll data for deciding what the most important issues of the day are.
It's important to keep in mind two things, I believe, in that regard. One is that this is not a zero-sum game. I mean, news coverage is not entirely or exclusively dictated by polling data, because there's a lot of space in terms of cyberspace, or even more traditionally on air, or even in print journalism. It's there's a lot of room for other
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and other stuff does get covered and does get a lot of attention. And as for being guided by polls, I think that's probably inevitable. The French have a phrase, an expression that I think is applicable here: "Faute de mieux." Faute de mieux. We don't have
Mm-hmm.
anything better. What else is there other than polls? I mean, it's kind of a backward compliment, but it's true. I mean, yard signs don't tell us who's going to win presidential
Mm-hmm.
elections. Man in the street interviews, person in the street interviews are just not, reliable enough. And you just don't know what kind of sample you have. And so that's not going to win you plaudits for exceptional election coverage. Counting the number of people who show up
Mm.
at rallies, I mean, another
Or the
misleading
or how loud the rallies are. I believe
number.
that was also a factor in a couple of elections, right?
So we see all these other options, but they don't seem to be anywhere near as effective sometimes as opinion polling. So faute de mieux, we're
Mhm.
stuck with the polls, and I think that pollsters, to their credit, are trying to find different ways of approaching would-be respondents, and getting their opinions. And it's not easy, it's not difficult, but the experimentation that has characterized the field over the last, I don't know, you could say easily 20, 25 years, but more intensely since the miscalls and misfires of 2016 and 2020, there's been a lot of experimentation going on and trying to tap the internet through approaches such as text to web, sending text messages to would-be respondents and asking them to respond or to complete a questionnaire online. Text to web is one modest approach that pollsters have adopted. Perhaps a more effective one is we'll see. But panels are
Hmm.
really big these days, in which people are recruited in generally, not always, but generally in probabilistic ways. Another sort of
Hmm.
a random sample of the American registered voters. All of them ostensibly have a chance of being included in the invitation to join a panel by which respondents who are recruited are asked to complete polls on a
Right.
periodic basis. And some of these panels are
Yeah.
really huge, numbering in the thousands of people
Hmm.
or even higher. And so relying on panels seems to be a trend uh, in polling, election polling. Also, another trend is not exclusively used by all pollsters, but it's a growing trend is called the
Hmm.
multi-mode approach, in which pollsters are using different techniques, different methodologies, different modes of interviewing to try to get a sample that's pretty good and
Hmm.
pretty representative. So they may be using panels and phone, panels and text to web, panels, text to web, and
Hmm.
robocalling. I mean, there's different ways in which these can be put together, and then they take the data and
Right.
stitch it together and come up with their poll. So a lot of experimentation. We just don't know how good it is, and but I don't think there's going to be a single method that's going to replace or going to be recognized as the gold standard as random digit dial
Right.
telephones were back in used by live operators. Live operator RDD polling was the gold standard in the 70s and 80s into the
Hmm.
90s. But after people got rid of landlines and then didn't, because of marketing researchers didn't answer their phones or
Yeah.
cell phones even, that has become far less
Yeah.
used by some pollsters. Some good pollsters do use it though. And Seltzer in Iowa,
Hmm.
of the Iowa poll, is still, I believe, largely uses telephones to reach respondents.
Yeah.
And so far so good. That is a uh, rated an A+ pollster, I think by
Hmm.
Nate Silver's
Yeah.
rankings.
I guess the place I want to kind of come to is as you look back across this history and this evolving relationship between news organizations, reporters, and pollsters, what do you think's gotten better over time, and what do you think's gotten worse?
Great question. It's pretty clear that polling remains a fragile enterprise. It may not be as prone to dramatic error as it was back in the
Hmm.
30s or 40s. I mean, polling failure doesn't always look like Dewey defeats Truman, that epic polling failure of 1948. But they do miss. And collectively, 2020 was the worst polling performance in a presidential election since 1984. So one might think that over time, the more practice and the more presidential elections pollsters have, the better they would get at it. And that does not seem to be the case. It does
Hmm.
not seem to be the case. But up until 1948, the pollsters, those early pollsters that we've talked about a couple of times, who we talked about, um, Roper and Gallup and Crossley, they thought that they had it pegged. Roper, in fact, said in 1948 that polling has come of age. It is
Yes.
no longer a new undertaking. This is
Yeah.
this is done. It's kind of like sound science or something, and it only to be proven
Hmm.
dramatically wrong. And it's difficult to get the sense of the opinions of a sprawling country such as the
Hmm.
United States. More than 330
Yeah.
people live in the country, and to really tap the sentiments of people who may not be as dialed into the political
Hmm.
scene as folks in Washington and New York and Los Angeles might be. But that's not to criticize the American population either. I mean, I think they're pretty much it's largely a savvy population, and it does not ignore presidential politics
Hmm.
by any means. They have really strong opinions. There are a lot of people out there eager and willing and can't wait to vote
Right.
against Donald Trump. And there are maybe just as many people who are eager and willing and can't wait to vote for
Mhm.
Donald Trump. So, I think that dichotomy there indicates that there's a good deal of interest, if visceral interest, but also I think
Mhm.
beyond that too. I mean, people vote their pocketbooks, and as the
Yeah.
cliche goes, and I think that's true.
What about maybe journalism's response to the criticism I get from pollsters about the obsession with the horse race and the imprecision about communicating the results? I know that there have been a lot of, in fact, Philip Bump today in the Post had a great series of charts to try to demonstrate just how uncertain everything was, and he gave you like the definitive map of the 24 election with 7 grayed out states with question marks on them. but but I think so. Maybe he's addressed the issue, but the kind of that is the kind of consistent critique, and then the advice for readers is always like read the methodology section, and I just want to suggest that that's very nice and no one's going to do that, but like,
Right.
so
I would agree.
so what would your
I
advice
would agree.
back be? What would your advice to the pollsters be for making journalists' jobs easier and making it more understandable for readers?
I think that readers in particular would be well advised to be cautious about polls. Any single discrete poll would be not held in suspicion, but maybe in detached wariness. Okay, I see what it says, but
Hmm.
all right, we'll see. We'll see. I think a better way to treat the polls, again, the population at large, would be to take a look at polling averages, such as those compiled by Real Clear
Hmm.
Politics, and it's I think a better, more accurate, perhaps, way of getting a sense of where polling is going is to take a look at the scope of the field rather than drill down on any particular poll. That said, I think it's also not unimportant to take a look at who's done well and who's done poorly in
Hmm.
elections past. And I mentioned CNN and
Hmm.
Quinnipiac, NBC News, Wall Street Journal as some of the ones who really overshot the 2020
Hmm.
election, and predicting Biden would do far better than he did in terms of the popular vote. That's not unimportant data to
Right.
keep in mind. It's not unimportant information to have in mind. Also, in the same token, to look at those who have done pretty well in recent elections.
Hmm.
Emerson College predicted or estimated that Biden was going to win by 5 points
Hmm.
in its last poll. Biden won by 4.5 points. That's pretty much spot on for
Yeah.
an election pollster. So, keeping tabs on individual pollsters such as Emerson College, or another one that goes by the acronym TIP,
Mhm.
TIPP. They were
Mm.
pretty close as well in 2020. Those are not unimportant pieces of information. We mentioned Phil Meyer earlier in the conversation, and he wrote a little known and a little remembered essay in a journal called Newspaper Research Journal 30 some years ago. And Phil said in that article, in that essay, that pollsters shouldn't be shy about saying that what they do in election polling is
Mm.
predicting. And it's important advice, but pollsters are just shy from
Mhm.
that. They say, now what we do is not prediction. It's estimates, but we're not forecasters and anything. But Phil Meyer was saying that this is important information, though, for the American public to have as to who's ahead and who's behind in a presidential election campaign
Mm.
or any election campaign, because elections are about who
Right.
wins and who loses, and the American public can do what it wants with that information that polls generate as to who's going to win and who's going to lose. I think that's sound advice. I think that's really inspired and insightful advice that both journalists and pollsters ought to do well
Mhm.
to embrace. That elections matter. Who wins and who loses is important. And if you get a sense of who's going to win and it's accurate, that by
Mhm.
definition is news, according to Phil Meyer.
Mhm.
And I agree with him. I agree with his take on this. So um, it's unfortunate that pollsters and journalists, in some respects, are shying away from the word prediction as if it were something that's just abhorrent. No, it's what they do. They don't do this. Pollsters don't do what they do. Election pollsters don't do what they do to
Mhm.
get it wrong. They do it to get it right. To give people a sense of where the American public seems to be lining up and regarding and viewing an upcoming
Hmm.
presidential election. And so that is not unimportant data to have. And again, as Phil Meyer said, people can do with it
Hmm.
what they will, what they want.
I think that's a great place to leave it. This was such a good conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this book that I can't stop thinking about. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate the homework, the legwork that you've done on this in preparation
Yeah,
for the interview. No, seriously, it was great. I mean, it went included the book,
of course.
for which
Yes.
I thank you, but went well beyond that as well. And it was a great conversation, very stimulating, and going back over the sweep of election polling, quasi
Hmm.
modern election polling back to the 30s and beyond is
Yeah,
it's a rare
of
treat, I
course.
must say. Thank you.
This is why I make the show. I'm a nerd about this stuff. Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.